The night I found the forged documents hidden in Victoria's study, I finally understood why my sister had been so insistent that I not worry about Mom's will. For months, she'd brushed off my questions with that patronizing smile, saying, "Everything's handled, Elena. Mom wanted it this way." But as I stared at two completely different versions of our mother's last will and testament, one leaving me our family home, the other cutting me out entirely, I realized Victoria hadn't just lied to me, she'd stolen my inheritance, forged legal documents, and spent months gaslighting me into believing our dying mother had simply chosen to leave me nothing. They thought I'd quietly accept their betrayal. Instead, I felt something crystallize inside me, cold, calculated justice. If my sister believed she could rewrite our mother's final wishes, then I would show her exactly what happens when you underestimate the daughter you tried to erase. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I used to believe in family loyalty, the kind where blood runs thicker than water, where siblings protect each other through life's storms, and where a parent's final wishes are sacred, honored without question. For 34 years, I thought Victoria and I had that bond. We'd grown up in the same house, shared the same bedrooms, survived our father's early death together, and watched our mother, Margaret, build a successful real estate business from nothing. Our childhood home in Phoenix sat on 3 acres of desert landscape that our mother had lovingly transformed into an oasis. Margaret Chen had purchased the property in 1987 for $38,000 when Victoria was 5 and I was 3. Over the decades, she'd built it into something extraordinary, a sprawling adobe-style house with hand-painted tiles, a guest casita, and gardens that bloomed year-round despite the harsh Arizona heat. The property was now worth over $2 million, but its real value couldn't be measured in money. Every room held memories. The kitchen, where Mom taught us to make her famous green chili enchiladas. The living room, where she'd read us bedtime stories long past when we'd outgrown them. The master bedroom, where she'd weathered her cancer treatments with a grace that still took my breath away. This wasn't just real estate, it was our family heart, our mother's legacy, our shared history written in adobe and desert stone. Victoria, being 2 years older, had always been the responsible one. She'd earned her MBA from Arizona State, married her college boyfriend Derek, and built a successful consulting firm that specialized in helping small businesses navigate complex regulations. I'd taken a different path, teaching middle school English, marrying David, a gentle man who worked as a park ranger, and choosing a quieter life focused on literature and education rather than profit margins. Mom never made us feel like one path was better than the other. She celebrated Victoria's business achievements with the same pride she showed when I won teaching awards. She displayed Derek's headshots alongside David's nature photography. She bragged equally about Victoria's luxury sedan and my hybrid that I drove until the wheels fell off. Margaret Chen believed success meant being true to yourself, not conforming to others' expectations. When Mom was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in March, Victoria immediately stepped into the role of primary caregiver and medical advocate. It made sense. She lived only 20 minutes away while David and I were 40 minutes out. She had the flexibility of running her own business, and she'd always been better at navigating bureaucracy and insurance companies. I was grateful for her take-charge attitude during those terrifying first weeks when we didn't know if Mom had months or years. "Don't worry about the logistics," Victoria assured me after Mom's first oncology appointment. "I'll handle the medical stuff, the insurance, all the paperwork. You just focus on spending quality time with her." It seemed like the perfect division of labor. Victoria managed the practical matters while I provided emotional support, reading to Mom during chemo sessions, organizing family photo albums, and helping her write letters to old friends. Derek handled the financial aspects of Mom's care, using his background in corporate finance to maximize her insurance benefits and manage her investment portfolio. For the first few months, this arrangement worked beautifully. Victoria would text me updates after every doctor's appointment, forward me insurance explanations, and coordinate our visiting schedules to ensure Mom always had family nearby. She seemed to relish being the responsible daughter, the one who could navigate complex medical systems and insurance requirements that left me feeling overwhelmed and helpless. Mom's condition deteriorated faster than anyone expected. By August, she needed round-the-clock care, and Victoria suggested hiring professional nurses rather than attempting to manage her care ourselves. It was a practical solution that allowed Mom to remain in her beloved home while receiving expert medical attention. "I've found an excellent agency," Victoria told me during one of our weekly coordination calls. "They specialize in end-of-life care, and their nurses are specifically trained for cancer patients. The cost is significant, but Mom can afford it, and it means we can focus on being daughters rather than amateur caregivers." The nurses were indeed excellent, compassionate, skilled, and dedicated to keeping Mom comfortable. But their presence also meant that my spontaneous visits became more structured. I couldn't just drop by when I felt like seeing Mom. I needed to coordinate with the nursing schedule, respect medication timing, and work around various medical procedures. Victoria assured me this was temporary, just until Mom's condition stabilized. But as weeks passed, I noticed that my access to Mom seemed increasingly filtered through Victoria's scheduling and the nurse's routines. When I called Mom's house phone, Victoria or a nurse usually answered. When I suggested taking Mom for short drives or bringing her favorite takeout, there always seemed to be medical reasons why it wasn't advisable. "She's having a difficult day," Victoria would explain when I called to check on Mom. "The new medication is making her nauseous, and Dr. Morrison wants her to rest. Maybe try calling tomorrow." Or, "The physical therapist is coming this afternoon, and then she has that appointment with the social worker. How about we plan something for the weekend instead?" I began to feel like a visitor in my own mother's life, requiring permission and scheduling to spend time with the woman who had raised me. But Victoria was handling everything so competently, managing complex medical schedules and insurance claims with an efficiency I couldn't match, that I hesitated to complain. Mom was receiving excellent care, and my sister seemed to have everything under control. During one of my scheduled visits in September, I mentioned to Mom that I'd been thinking about taking some time off work to help with her care more directly. Her eyes lit up with genuine joy. "Oh, sweetheart, that would be wonderful," she said, squeezing my hand with surprising strength. "I miss our daily conversations. Sometimes I feel like I'm living in a medical facility rather than my own home." But when I discussed this plan with Victoria later that evening, her response was swift and firm. "Elena, that's incredibly sweet, but completely unnecessary," she said, her tone suggesting I'd propose something both impractical and mildly irresponsible. "Mom needs consistent professional care, not well-meaning but untrained family members disrupting her routine. The nurses have everything under control, and Derek and I are managing all the administrative aspects. Taking time off work would hurt your family financially without providing any real benefit to Mom." Her logic was sound, her delivery was gentle, and her concern for my financial well-being seemed genuine. But something about the conversation left me feeling dismissed, as if my desire to care for my dying mother was a naive impulse that needed to be managed rather than honored. Still, I trusted Victoria's judgment. She'd always been the practical one, the sister who could see the bigger picture while I got caught up in emotions. If she believed professional care was best for Mom, then I would respect that decision and find other ways to support our mother through her final months. What I didn't realize was that Victoria was already 3 steps ahead, quietly positioning herself not just as Mom's primary caregiver, but as the sole decision-maker for our family's future. While I focused on treasuring my remaining time with Mom, my sister was systematically taking control of everything that would matter after Mom was gone. October brought a false sense of normalcy to our family crisis. Mom's condition had stabilized somewhat. She wasn't getting better, but the aggressive decline had slowed, giving us what Dr. Morrison cautiously called quality time. Victoria seemed to have settled into her role as family coordinator with remarkable efficiency, managing medical appointments, insurance claims, and household logistics with the same precision she brought to her business consulting. From the outside, we probably looked like the perfect family navigating tragedy with grace and unity. Victoria was the capable eldest daughter, taking charge of practical matters. I was the supportive younger sister, providing emotional comfort and maintaining family traditions. Derek handled financial complexities, while David offered quiet strength and helped with household maintenance. Even Mom seemed to appreciate how well we were all working together. "I'm so proud of how you girls are handling everything," Mom told us during one of our Sunday family dinners, a tradition Victoria had insisted we maintain, despite the complicated logistics of wheelchair accessibility and medication schedules. "Your father would be amazed at how strong and capable you've both become." Victoria beamed at the praise, reaching over to squeeze Mom's hand. "We're just doing what family does, Mom, taking care of each other." But beneath this harmonious surface, subtle changes were reshaping our family dynamics in ways I didn't immediately recognize. Victoria had developed an impressive network of professionals who deferred to her judgment on all matters relating to Mom's care. Dr. Morrison called Victoria first with test results and treatment updates. The nursing agency coordinator checked with Victoria before making any changes to Mom's care schedule. Even Mom's longtime attorney, Frank Rodriguez, seemed to route all communications through Victoria rather than speaking directly with Mom. "It's just more efficient," Victoria explained when I mentioned that I'd like to speak directly with Dr. Morrison about Mom's prognosis. "He knows I'll relay everything accurately, and it saves him from having to repeat the same information multiple times. Plus, medical terminology can be confusing if you don't have a business background." The implication stung that I, with my master's degree in education, couldn't understand medical information that Victoria, with her MBA, could easily process. But she delivered the comment with such casual confidence that questioning it seemed petty. Victoria had also implemented what she called systems to manage Mom's care more efficiently. There was a communication system where all family members received weekly email updates instead of calling Mom directly with questions. A scheduling system where visits needed to be coordinated through Victoria to avoid conflicts with medical appointments. A financial system where Derek tracked all care-related expenses and managed Mom's accounts to ensure bills were paid efficiently. These systems undoubtedly made things run more smoothly, but they also centralized all information and decision-making authority with Victoria. I found myself increasingly dependent on my sister for basic information about our mother's condition, treatment plans, and daily needs. When I suggested taking Mom to her favorite Mexican restaurant for lunch, something she'd mentioned missing, Victoria consulted with the head nurse, reviewed Mom's medication schedule, and determined that restaurant outings posed too many variables to manage safely. What if she has a bad reaction to the food? What if she needs her afternoon medication while you're out? What if the restaurant isn't wheelchair accessible? Victoria's concerns were valid, but her tone suggested that my impulse to treat Mom to a simple pleasure was recklessly naive. Instead, Victoria arranged for the restaurant to deliver Mom's favorite meal to the house, complete with proper serving dishes and cloth napkins. It was thoughtful and practical, but it wasn't the same as getting Mom out of the house, away from the medical equipment and constant reminders of her illness, even briefly. I began to notice that many of my suggestions for Mom's care were met with similar responses. Victoria would acknowledge the sweet intention behind my ideas, consult with various professionals, and then implement modified versions that addressed practical concerns I hadn't considered. She was never dismissive or unkind, but the pattern was clear. Victoria made the real decisions, while I provided emotional support within carefully managed parameters. The financial aspects of Mom's care were particularly opaque to me. Derek had taken over managing Mom's accounts, paying medical bills, and coordinating with insurance companies. He provided detailed monthly reports that showed every expense and reimbursement, but the numbers were overwhelming and difficult to interpret without his background knowledge. The important thing is that Mom can afford excellent care without depleting her assets, Derek assured me when I asked questions about the mounting costs. We're making sure every dollar is maximized and that we're taking advantage of every available benefit.
When I wondered aloud whether Mom might want to be involved in these financial decisions, Victoria gently reminded me that managing complex medical billing was stressful and confusing for healthy people, much less someone dealing with cancer treatment. Mom specifically asked us to handle these details so she doesn't have to worry about them, Victoria said. She trusts us to make good decisions, and honestly, Elena, some of these insurance forms are incredibly complex. Even I have to research terminology and regulations constantly. Again, the implication was clear. If these matters were too complex for Victoria's business expertise, they were certainly beyond my capabilities as a middle school teacher. Mom seemed genuinely grateful to be shielded from financial and administrative burdens, so I didn't push the issue. But I couldn't shake the feeling that important conversations were happening without me, that decisions affecting our family's future were being made in meetings I wasn't invited to attend. By November, Victoria had become the de facto spokesperson for our family. When concerned friends called to check on Mom, they were often directed to Victoria for updates. When Mom's church wanted to organize meal deliveries, they coordinated with Victoria. When neighbors asked how they could help, Victoria managed those offers with the same efficiency she brought to everything else. "It's easier to have one point of contact," she explained when I mentioned feeling disconnected from Mom's broader support network. "Otherwise, information gets confused, people duplicate efforts, and Mom gets overwhelmed with too many visitors and phone calls." The logic was sound, but the result was that Victoria controlled not just the flow of information, but also the narrative about Mom's condition and our family's needs. She decided which offers of help to accept, which visitors were appropriate for Mom's energy levels, and which activities fit within the medical care routine. I found myself increasingly isolated from the community of people who wanted to support our family through this difficult time. Friends would mention conversations they'd had with Victoria about Mom's condition, conversations I knew nothing about. Church members would ask me to pass along messages that Victoria had apparently requested. Neighbors would reference plans Victoria had mentioned that were news to me. Most concerning was that I seemed to be losing touch with Mom's own preferences and desires. When I asked her directly what she wanted, whether she'd like certain visitors, what foods sounded appealing, how she preferred to spend her time, she often seemed uncertain, deferring to whatever Victoria had already arranged. "Victoria knows what's best" became Mom's standard response to questions about her care. "She's thought of everything I need." It was heartbreaking to watch my strong, independent mother, a woman who'd built a successful business and raised 2 daughters as a single parent, become so dependent on my sister's judgment. But Victoria's care was undeniably excellent. Her attention to detail was impressive, and Mom's medical needs were being met with professional competence. Still, something felt fundamentally wrong about how completely Victoria had taken over our mother's life. But questioning my sister's methods seemed ungrateful when she was sacrificing so much time and energy to ensure Mom received the best possible care. I told myself that these concerns were probably just my own discomfort with feeling helpless in the face of Mom's illness. I had no idea that Victoria's systematic control over every aspect of Mom's care was actually preparation for something much more calculated and devastating than I could have imagined.
December brought the first snow Phoenix had seen in years, a light dusting that transformed our desert landscape into something magical and unexpected. Mom was having one of her better days, sitting by her bedroom window and marveling at the white powder coating her beloved Palo Verde trees. It was during this peaceful moment that I first witnessed something that should have set off every alarm bell in my head. I'd arrived from my usual Thursday afternoon visit to find Victoria in Mom's home office, surrounded by legal documents and manila folders spread across the large oak desk that had belonged to our father. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear me come in through the front door. "What are you working on?" I asked, stepping into the doorway of the office. Victoria startled, quickly gathering several papers and sliding them into a folder before turning to face me with her characteristic bright smile. "Oh, just organizing Mom's paperwork. You know how she's always been about keeping every document, but there's no real system to any of it." The explanation seemed reasonable. Mom had indeed been a pack rat when it came to important papers, keeping decades of tax returns, insurance policies, and legal documents in various boxes and filing cabinets. But something about Victoria's rushed movements and the way she'd quickly hidden whatever she'd been reviewing struck me as odd. Need any help? I offered, genuinely wanting to contribute to what seemed like a necessary but overwhelming task. That's sweet, but I've got it under control, Victoria replied, her tone friendly but firm. This stuff is pretty boring, mostly just old utility bills and insurance paperwork. Nothing that needs two people sorting through it. As we walked toward Mom's bedroom together, I noticed Victoria was carrying a folder she'd hastily filled with whatever documents she'd been reviewing. She kept it close to her body, like a student protecting exam answers, which seemed strange for routine paperwork organization. Over the following weeks, I began noticing that Victoria always seemed to be working on organizing Mom's documents whenever I arrived for unscheduled visits. The home office, which had once been open and accessible, now felt like Victoria's private workspace. Important-looking papers were always spread across the desk, but they were invariably gathered up and put away before I could see what specific document she was reviewing. When I mentioned to Mom that Victoria was doing such a thorough job organizing her paperwork, Mom looked genuinely confused. "What paperwork?" she asked, her brow furrowing with concentration. I thought Victoria was just helping me understand some of the medical billing statements. "All your legal documents and files," I clarified. "She said you'd kept everything, but without much organization." Mom's confusion deepened. "Honey, Frank Rodriguez has always handled my important legal documents. Everything's been properly filed and organized for years. What exactly is Victoria sorting through?" I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the unusual December weather. If Mom's legal documents were already properly organized and maintained by her longtime attorney, what exactly was Victoria spending so much time reviewing and reorganizing? During this same period, I noticed that Victoria had developed an impressive knowledge of Mom's financial situation. She could quote the approximate values of Mom's investment accounts, knew the details of her insurance policies, and seemed familiar with the tax implications of various assets. When I asked how she'd learned so much about Mom's finances, Victoria credited Derek's expertise and her own business background. "Derek's been helping me understand the financial side of things," she explained. "It's important that someone in the family knows the big picture, especially with all the medical expenses. We want to make sure Mom's resources are managed properly." Again, the explanation seemed logical, but I couldn't understand why these important financial discussions were happening without me. Even if my teaching background didn't provide expertise in estate planning or financial management, wasn't I still entitled to basic information about our family situation? I tried raising this concern with David, who listened thoughtfully but seemed to think I was being overly sensitive. "Victoria's always been the take charge type," he reminded me. "She's probably just trying to spare you from dealing with complicated financial and legal details while you're focused on spending time with your mom. That seems pretty considerate, actually." David's perspective was reassuring, and I wanted to believe he was right. Victoria had always been protective of me, shielding me from unpleasant realities when we were children, and helping me navigate complex situations throughout our adult lives. Maybe her current behavior was just an extension of that lifelong pattern. But late one evening in mid-December, I discovered something that shattered this comforting interpretation of Victoria's actions. I'd stopped by Mom's house to drop off some books I thought she might enjoy, using the spare key Mom had given me years earlier. The house was dark, except for a light in the home office where I could see Victoria working at the desk despite the late hour. Rather than disturbing her, I quietly left the books on the kitchen counter and wrote a note explaining what I'd brought. As I prepared to leave, I heard Victoria on the phone with someone, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet house. "No, she doesn't need to be involved in this conversation. Elena's very emotional about Mom's situation, and these kinds of decisions are better made by people who can think objectively about what's best for everyone." I froze in the kitchen, straining to hear more of the conversation. "I understand the legal requirements," Victoria continued, "but there are ways to structure things that protect Mom's intentions while being realistic about family dynamics.
Elena's always been idealistic about money. She has no concept of what it takes to manage significant assets responsibly. The person on the other end of the call seemed to be asking questions because Victoria paused frequently before responding. Exactly. Mom's primary concern is making sure her legacy is preserved and managed by someone who understands financial responsibility. The house alone is worth over $2 million now, and Elena's never owned anything more valuable than a used car. She'd probably want to turn it into some kind of charity project or let it deteriorate because she doesn't understand property maintenance. I felt sick listening to my sister describe me as financially irresponsible and naive. But what terrified me more was the clinical way she was discussing our mother's legacy and intentions as if Mom had already died and Victoria was the sole authority on what she would have wanted. The conversation was concluded with Victoria saying, "I'll have everything ready for review by the end of the week. Make sure the documentation is absolutely clear about Mom's reasoning for these decisions." As I crept out of the house, my hands shaking as I locked the door behind me, I realized that Victoria wasn't just organizing Mom's paperwork or educating herself about estate planning. She was actively planning for Mom's death and making decisions about our family's future, decisions that apparently didn't include me in any meaningful way. For the first time since Mom's diagnosis, I felt genuinely afraid, not just of losing our mother, but of discovering what Victoria had been planning while I naively focused on treasuring our remaining time together.
January arrived with a harsh desert wind that stripped the last leaves from Mom's mesquite trees, leaving the landscape bare and unforgiving. Mom's condition had worsened over the holidays, confining her mostly to bed and requiring increased pain medication that left her drowsy and confused for much of each day. What I didn't realize was that Victoria would use Mom's declining mental clarity as the perfect opportunity to accelerate whatever plan she'd been developing. The first sign came during what should have been a routine family meeting to discuss Mom's care needs. Victoria had suggested we all gather on a Sunday afternoon to review Mom's medical status and make decisions about increasing her care level. Dr. Morrison had recommended transitioning to hospice care, a conversation that required the whole family's input. I arrived at Mom's house expecting a difficult but necessary discussion about end-of-life planning. Instead, I found Victoria and Derek sitting at the dining room table with several stacks of documents, legal pads covered with notes, and what appeared to be financial spreadsheets spread across the surface. "Where's Mom?" I asked, noticing her absence from what was supposed to be a family meeting about her care. "She's resting," Victoria replied without looking up from the papers. "The pain medication makes these kinds of conversations too difficult for her to follow, so Derek and I thought we'd hash out the details first and then present her with our recommendations." The casual way Victoria had excluded our dying mother from decisions about her own care was breathtaking, but before I could object, Derek began presenting what they called a comprehensive care transition plan. According to their research, transitioning to hospice care would require several immediate changes to Mom's living situation. The house would need to be prepared for increased medical equipment, certain legal documents would need to be updated to reflect Mom's changing capacity for decision-making, financial arrangements would need to be streamlined to ensure all care costs were covered efficiently. The most important thing, Derek explained, consulting his notes, is establishing clear medical and financial power of attorney while Mom is still capable of signing legal documents. Dr. Morrison says her cognitive clarity is inconsistent now, so we have a limited window to get everything properly documented. I felt like I was watching a business presentation rather than a family discussion about our mother's final months. Victoria and Derek had clearly spent considerable time developing their plan, complete with timelines, cost analyses, and legal recommendations. When I asked why I hadn't been included in these preliminary discussions, Victoria's response was swift and patronizing. "Elena, we know how emotional this whole situation has been for you. Derek and I thought it would be easier to work through the practical details first so we could present you with clear options rather than overwhelming you with all the complex logistics." There was that word again, emotional.
as if caring deeply about our mother's welfare somehow disqualified me from participating in decisions about her care, as if my teaching career hadn't required me to handle difficult situations, work with grieving families, and make complex decisions under pressure. But before I could voice these objections, Victoria continued with her presentation. She explained that she and Derek had already consulted with Frank Rodriguez about updating Mom's legal documents. They'd researched the best hospice agencies in Phoenix and gotten preliminary cost estimates. They'd even spoken with a contractor about necessary modifications to make the house more accessible for medical equipment. "We've tried to think of everything," Victoria concluded, "but obviously we want your input before we move forward with any of these recommendations." Except their recommendations felt more like decisions that had already been made. When I suggested alternative approaches, maybe keeping Mom more involved in the decision-making process, or exploring different hospice agencies, or considering whether Mom might prefer to spend her final weeks somewhere else than the house, Victoria had ready responses that dismissed each suggestion. Mom was too confused by her medication to participate meaningfully in complex decisions. The hospice agency Victoria had selected was clearly the best option based on their research. The house was the only practical choice because it could accommodate necessary medical equipment while allowing Mom to remain in familiar surroundings. Every alternative I proposed was met with detailed explanations of why Victoria and Derek's approach was more practical, more cost-effective, or more aligned with Mom's best interests. I began to feel like a child being patiently corrected by adults who'd already figured out the right answers. The most concerning development was how quickly Victoria moved to implement their plan once she'd presented it. Within 3 days of our family meeting, she'd scheduled appointments with Frank Rodriguez to update Mom's legal documents. She'd contacted the hospice agency to begin the intake process. She'd arranged for the contractor to assess necessary house modifications.
When I called Mom to ask about these rapid developments, she seemed genuinely confused about what was happening. "Victoria says there are papers I need to sign," Mom told me, her voice weak but concerned. "Something about making sure you girls can help me with medical decisions. But everything's happening so fast, and I can't seem to focus well enough to understand what it all means." I felt a surge of protective anger. Our mother, already struggling with pain and medication side effects, was being pressured to sign important legal documents while she was admittedly too confused to understand their implications. "Mom, you don't have to sign anything you don't understand," I told her firmly. "These decisions can wait until you're feeling clearer or until we can review everything together." But when I called Victoria to suggest slowing down the legal documentation process, her response revealed just how far she'd already advanced her planning. "Elena, we can't afford to wait," she said, her voice tight with impatience. Dr. Morrison was very clear that Mom's cognitive function is declining rapidly. If we don't get these documents signed while she's still legally competent, we could lose the ability to make necessary medical and financial decisions entirely. She paused, then continued with what sounded like a rehearsed explanation. "Frank Rodriguez confirmed that Mom's current power of attorney documents are outdated and don't cover the specific medical situations we're facing now. We need comprehensive healthcare directives and updated financial power of attorney, and Mom needs to sign them while she's still mentally capable of understanding what she's agreeing to." Victoria's urgency seemed genuine, but something about the situation felt manipulative. Why hadn't these legal inadequacies been identified months earlier when Mom was still mentally sharp? Why was everything suddenly so urgent that it couldn't wait for Mom to have a clear day? When I spoke with Frank Rodriguez directly, his responses were professional but evasive. "Your sister has raised some important points about ensuring your mother's legal documents are comprehensive," he told me. "Given Mrs. Chen's current medical situation, it's prudent to update her directives while she's still capable of making informed decisions." "But does this really need to happen so quickly?" I pressed. "Mom seems very confused right now." I understand your concern, Frank replied carefully, but legal competency doesn't require perfect mental clarity, just the ability to understand the nature and consequences of the decisions being made. If we wait much longer, Mrs. Chen's condition could deteriorate to the point where any new documents could be legally challenged. His explanation sounded reasonable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria was orchestrating a sense of urgency that didn't necessarily exist. Why was she so determined to get these documents signed immediately while Mom was at her most vulnerable and confused? The answer came 2 days later, when I arrived at Mom's house to find Victoria and a notary public in the living room, with Mom propped up in her hospital bed, looking dazed and overwhelmed. "Perfect timing," Victoria said brightly when she saw me. "We're just finishing up the legal documentation. Mom's been such a trooper about getting through all these complicated papers." I looked at our mother, who appeared exhausted and confused, her signature shaky on documents she clearly didn't understand. In that moment, I realized that Victoria hadn't been preparing for Mom's eventual death. She'd been preparing to control it. And I was already too late to stop whatever she just convinced our vulnerable mother to sign. February marked the beginning of what I now recognized as Victoria's final phase, systematically cutting me off from any meaningful access to Mom while positioning herself as the sole gatekeeper of our mother's final weeks. What made this campaign particularly insidious was how Victoria framed each restriction as being in Mom's best interest, making me seem selfish for questioning limitations that were supposedly protecting our dying mother. The new hospice care arrangement provided Victoria with the perfect framework for controlling my access to Mom. The hospice team, led by a compassionate but firm nurse named Patricia, had established strict protocols for managing Mom's pain medication, sleep schedule, and visitor interactions. Victoria positioned herself as the primary contact for all hospice communications, which meant that any changes to Mom's routine had to be approved through her. "Mom's having a really rough week," became Victoria's standard explanation whenever I called to arrange a visit. "Patricia thinks it's best to limit visitors to essential care providers and immediate family only. Maybe try calling on Thursday. She usually has better days midweek." But when Thursday arrived, there would be a new reason why visiting wasn't advisable. Mom was having tests done. She was trying a new medication that required monitoring. She was sleeping more to conserve energy. There was always a medically sound reason why my presence would be disruptive to Mom's carefully managed care routine. The few times I did manage to see Mom, I was shocked by how much she deteriorated, not just physically, but mentally. The vibrant, sharp woman who'd built a real estate empire seemed to have disappeared, replaced by someone who struggled to follow conversations and often seemed unsure of basic details about her own life. "Elena, sweetheart," she said during one of my brief visits, "remind me again, when did you graduate from college? I keep trying to remember, but everything feels so fuzzy." I'd graduated 12 years earlier, an event Mom had celebrated by taking me on a trip to Europe. That she couldn't remember such a significant milestone was devastating. But what troubled me more was how quickly these episodes of confusion seemed to be progressing. When I mentioned my concerns to Patricia, the hospice nurse, she explained that cognitive decline was, unfortunately, common in pancreatic cancer patients, especially when combined with strong pain medications. Mrs. Chen's confusion is likely a combination of the disease progression and the medication levels needed to keep her comfortable, Patricia told me with professional kindness. "It's very difficult for families to watch, but the priority at this stage is managing her pain rather than maintaining mental clarity." Patricia's explanation was medically sound, but something about Mom's specific type of confusion bothered me. She would forget recent conversations, but then suddenly remember vivid details from decades past. She'd struggle with simple questions, but then demonstrate perfect clarity about complex family relationships. Her confusion seemed selective in ways that didn't match my understanding of typical medication-related cognitive impairment. During one of my limited visits, I decided to test my suspicions by asking Mom about her estate planning. "Mom, have you been thinking about how you want your affairs handled after you're gone?" I asked gently.
Her response was immediate and surprisingly clear. Oh, Victoria's taking care of all that. She knows exactly what I want, and she's making sure everything is arranged properly. I don't need to worry about those details anymore. But what specifically do you want? I pressed. What are your actual wishes about the house, your investments, your personal belongings? Mom's face scrunched of the concentration, but instead of answering, she became visibly agitated. I can't remember the details, she said, her voice rising with frustration. Victoria explained it all to me, but there were so many papers and numbers. She said not to worry about it, that she'd handle everything the way I wanted. The conversation revealed something deeply troubling. Mom seemed to have crystal clear memory about delegating all decisions to Victoria, but no recollection of what her own preferences actually were. It was as if she'd been convinced to trust Victoria's judgment completely, while simultaneously being kept from understanding what that judgment entailed. When I tried to discuss this pattern with David, he was skeptical of my concerns. Elena, your mom is dying. Of course she's confused and struggling to remember things. It's probably a relief for her to know that Victoria has everything under control, so she doesn't have to worry about complicated decisions while she's dealing with so much pain. David's perspective was reasonable, but it didn't address what I was observing during my visits. Mom wasn't just confused. She was displaying a specific pattern of memory and confusion that seemed to center around estate planning and family finances. I decided to test this theory by asking Mom about other complex topics during my next visit. When I asked about her real estate business, she could recall detailed information about properties she'd sold decades earlier. When I asked about our father's death and how she'd managed as a single mother, she provided vivid, coherent memories. But when I asked about recent conversations with Victoria about legal documents or financial planning, she became confused and anxious. Victoria handles all that now, became her automatic response to any question about her estate or final wishes. She knows what's best for our family. The most disturbing discovery came when I asked Mom if she remembered signing any legal documents recently. Documents? She asked, looking genuinely puzzled. What kind of documents? Power of attorney papers or updated will information, I clarified. Victoria mentioned that you'd been working with Frank Rodriguez on some legal updates. Mom's confusion deepened. I don't remember signing anything important recently. Are you sure that happened? Maybe you should ask Victoria. She keeps track of all those business things better than I do. My blood ran cold. Mom had no memory of the legal document signing session I'd witnessed just weeks earlier. Either her cognitive decline was more severe than anyone realized, or something was seriously wrong with the way those documents had been obtained. That evening, I called Frank Rodriguez's office and requested a meeting to discuss my concerns about Mom's mental state during recent legal proceedings. His secretary scheduled an appointment for the following week, but when I arrived at his office, Frank seemed prepared for my questions in a way that suggested Victoria had already spoken with him. I understand you have concerns about your mother's mental state during our recent meetings. I want to assure you that I was very careful to assess Mrs. Chen's competency before proceeding with any legal documentation. What exactly did she sign? I asked directly. Frank consulted his files, then provided a list that made my stomach drop. Updated power of attorney documents, giving Victoria broad authority over Mom's medical and financial decisions. A revised healthcare directive specifying end-of-life preferences. And most shocking of all, a codicil to Mom's will that apparently reflected changes in her wishes regarding asset distribution. Changes to her will? I repeated, struggling to keep my voice steady. What kind of changes? Frank's response was professional but evasive. The specific details are confidential, but I can tell you that your mother expressed concerns about ensuring her estate is managed by someone with appropriate financial expertise. The changes reflect her desire to protect her legacy and ensure responsible stewardship of her assets. The language he used, financial expertise, responsible stewardship, sounded exactly like phrases Victoria had used in the phone conversation I'd overheard.
It was as if Frank was reciting talking points Victoria had provided, rather than describing Mom's own expressed wishes. As I left Frank's office, I realized that Victoria hadn't just been planning for Mom's death, she'd been rewriting it. While I'd focused on making Mom's final months meaningful and comfortable, my sister had been systematically isolating her, manipulating her confusion, and using her vulnerability to alter fundamental decisions about our family's future. The most terrifying part was that it was probably already too late to stop her. Whatever documents Mom had signed during her confused state were now legally binding, and Victoria had positioned herself as the sole authority on interpreting and implementing Mom's wishes. I was losing my mother to cancer, but I was also losing her to my sister's calculated manipulation. And I wasn't sure which loss would be more devastating.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Mom died on a quiet Tuesday morning in March, with spring rain pattering against her bedroom windows and the scent of desert wildflowers drifting through the house she'd loved for over 30 years. I wasn't there when it happened. Victoria called me at 6:47 a.m., her voice carefully controlled but strained with what sounded like genuine grief. "Elena, you need to come to the house. Mom passed away about an hour ago, peacefully, in her sleep." The drive to Mom's house passed in a blur of shock and sorrow. Despite knowing this day was inevitable, despite months of preparation and gradual goodbyes, the finality of Mom's death hit me like a physical blow. Our mother, the woman who'd taught us to be strong, who'd built a business from nothing, who'd held our family together after Dad's death, was gone. I arrived to find the house already bustling with activity that seemed surreal in its efficiency. The hospice team was there, handling the medical formalities with professional compassion. A representative from the funeral home Victoria had selected was discussing arrangements with Derek. Victoria herself moved through the house with purposeful energy, making phone calls and checking items off what appeared to be a detailed to-do list. "The funeral home will handle everything from here," Victoria told me as we stood in Mom's bedroom, looking at the empty hospital bed that had dominated the space for months. "I've already given them the information they need, and they'll coordinate with the church for the service on Friday." Friday. 4 days away. I was still processing the fact that Mom was gone, and Victoria had already planned her funeral. "Don't we need to discuss the arrangements together?" I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the rapid pace of decisions being made around me. "I discussed everything with Mom over the past few weeks," Victoria replied, her tone gentle but firm. She was very specific about what she wanted: a simple service at St. Matthew's, burial next to Dad at Desert View Cemetery, and a small reception afterwards. She didn't want a big fuss or a lot of drama. Victoria's description of Mom's wishes sounded plausible, but the timing troubled me. When had these detailed conversations about funeral arrangements taken place? During my limited visits over the past month, Mom had seemed too confused and medicated to engage in complex planning discussions. But questioning Victoria's account of Mom's final wishes seemed petty and inappropriate while we were both still processing our grief. Instead, I focused on supporting the arrangements Victoria had made and trying to honor our mother's memory in whatever way seemed most appropriate. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of funeral preparations, family notifications, and the surreal logistics that accompany death. Victoria handled most of the arrangements with the same efficiency she'd brought to managing Mom's care, while I focused on writing a eulogy and coordinating with Mom's friends and former colleagues who wanted to pay their respects. The funeral service was beautiful and dignified, exactly what Mom would have wanted. St. Matthew's was filled with people whose lives she'd touched: former clients, business associates, neighbors, and friends dating back decades. The eulogies painted a picture of a woman who'd been strong, generous, and deeply loved by her community. But as I listened to person after person share memories of Mom's kindness and wisdom, I felt a growing disconnect between the woman being celebrated and the confused, vulnerable person Victoria had been managing for the past several months. These speakers remembered Mom as sharp, decisive, and fiercely independent, qualities that seemed incompatible with someone who'd willingly surrendered all decision-making authority to one daughter while excluding the other.
Even more troubling were the comments from people who'd tried to discuss estate planning or financial matters with Mom during her illness. Frank Rodriguez's law partner mentioned that several of Mom's longtime financial advisors had been confused when Victoria contacted them about changes to investment accounts and insurance beneficiaries. "Your mother had worked with the same financial team for over 15 years, he told me quietly. They were surprised when Victoria said Margaret wanted to make significant changes to her portfolio management. It seemed out of character for someone who'd always been very hands-on with her investments." By the end of the reception, I'd heard enough to confirm my worst fears. Victoria hadn't just managed Mom's care during her final months. She'd systematically isolated her from anyone who might have questioned the decisions being made on her behalf. But the most shocking revelation came 3 days after the funeral, when Victoria called to schedule what she termed the will reading. "Frank Rodriguez wants to meet with us next Tuesday to review Mom's final wishes," Victoria told me over the phone. "It's mostly just a formality. You know how Mom was about proper procedures, but we need to handle the legal requirements for the estate." Will reading seemed like an antiquated term, something from old movies rather than modern estate planning. When I mentioned this to David, he agreed that it seemed unusual. Most estate lawyers just send copies of the will to the beneficiaries. Formal readings are pretty rare unless there are complex assets or unusual circumstances. Unusual circumstances. The phrase stuck with me as I prepared for Tuesday's meeting. What unusual circumstances would require a formal will reading? What complications had Victoria and Frank Rodriguez anticipated that would necessitate such a formal presentation of Mom's final wishes? I arrived at Frank's office on Tuesday morning expecting a straightforward review of Mom's estate plan. Instead, I walked into what felt like an ambush designed to deliver news that would fundamentally alter my understanding of my relationship with my mother and my place in our family. Victoria was already seated at the conference table when I arrived, looking composed and professional in a dark business suit. Frank Rodriguez sat across from her with several thick folders and a somber expression that suggested this would be far from a routine meeting. "Elena, thank you for coming," Frank said as I took the empty seat next to Victoria. "I know this is a difficult time, but we need to review your mother's final estate planning documents and discuss the implementation of her wishes." As he opened the first folder and began pulling out official-looking papers, I noticed Victoria watching my face with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not grief, not sympathy, but something that looked almost like anticipation. In that moment, I realized that this meeting wasn't about honoring Mom's wishes. It was about revealing the full extent of whatever Victoria had been planning for the past year. And I was about to discover just how completely my sister had succeeded in rewriting our family's future. "Before we begin," Frank said, adjusting his reading glasses and opening the top folder, "I want to emphasize that your mother was very thoughtful about these decisions. She spent considerable time discussing her wishes with me and wanted to ensure that her estate would be managed in a way that reflects her values and concerns for both of her daughters." The formal language felt ominous, like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. Frank pulled out a document that I recognized as a last will and testament, though it looked thicker and more complex than I'd expected. "Your mother's primary asset is, of course, the family home and its 3 acres, currently valued at approximately $2.3 million, Frank continued. She also had investment accounts totaling roughly $800,000, her business assets, and various personal property of significant value. I nodded, though the number seemed surreal. I'd known Mom was financially comfortable, but hearing the actual figures made me realize how substantial her estate really was. More importantly, it helped me understand why Victoria might have been so motivated to control the distribution of these assets. Now, Frank said, his tone becoming more serious, your mother's will reflects some changes she made during her final months. These changes represent her evolving thinking about how best to ensure her legacy is preserved and managed responsibly. He handed me a copy of the will, and I began reading while he provided a summary. The first few pages contained standard legal language, but as I reached the section detailing asset distribution, my hands began to shake. According to the document, Mom had left the family home entirely to Victoria, along with the majority of her investment accounts and business assets. I was designated to receive her personal belongings, some family jewelry, and a modest cash bequest of $50,000. The disparity was so extreme that I initially assumed I'd misunderstood something. I read the relevant sections twice, then looked up at Frank with confusion. There must be some mistake, I said, my voice sounding strange and distant. This says Victoria gets the house and most of the financial assets, while I get personal items and $50,000? That's correct, Frank confirmed gently. Your mother felt that Victoria's business background and financial expertise made her the most appropriate person to maintain and manage the family property. She was concerned about ensuring the house would be properly preserved and that the estate's assets would be handled responsibly. The explanation sounded exactly like the language Victoria had used in the phone conversation I had overheard months earlier. The emphasis on financial expertise and responsible management felt like Victoria's words coming out of Frank's mouth. When did Mom make these changes? I asked, struggling to process what I was hearing. The final version of her will was executed in January, Frank replied, consulting his notes. Your mother was very clear about her reasoning. She felt that the family home represented a significant financial responsibility that required someone with appropriate business experience to manage effectively. January. During the period when Mom was most confused and medicated, when Victoria had rushed to get legal documents signed while Mom could barely follow conversations, the timing couldn't have been more suspicious. I need to see the previous version of her will, the one she had before these changes. Frank and Victoria exchanged a glance that lasted just a moment too long. I'm not sure that's necessary, Victoria said, speaking for the first time since I'd arrived. Mom's final wishes are clear, and rehashing old versions would just be confusing and upsetting. I want to see what she originally intended, I insisted, turning to Frank. Surely you have copies of her previous estate planning documents. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the request. While I do maintain historical documents, the current will represents your mother's final and definitive wishes. Previous versions are superseded and not really relevant to the current estate distribution. His reluctance to show me Mom's original will only deepened my suspicions. If the changes had been straightforward and reasonable, why would there be any problem with showing me what Mom had previously intended? Frank, I said, trying to keep my voice calm and professional, as one of Mom's beneficiaries, don't I have a legal right to review the history of her estate planning documents, especially if there were significant changes made during a period when her mental capacity might have been compromised? The question clearly made Frank uncomfortable. He consulted with some papers, then spoke carefully. Elena, I want to assure you that I was very careful to assess your mother's mental competency before finalizing any changes to her estate plan. She understood the nature and consequences of the decisions she was making.
But you have to admit her mental state was compromised by medication and illness. Multiple people at her funeral mentioned that she seemed confused and disoriented during her final months. Victoria finally intervened, her voice taking on the patronizing tone I'd grown to hate.
Elena, I know this is disappointing, she said, but Mom was very thoughtful about these decisions. She talked to me extensively about her concerns regarding the house and the financial responsibility it represents. She knew you and David are more focused on your teaching careers than on property management or investment planning. There it was again. The implication that my career choice somehow disqualified me from being trusted with family assets. The suggestion that because I'd chosen teaching over business, I was inherently less capable of managing property or making financial decisions. That's not Mom's voice, I said, my composure finally beginning to crack. Those aren't her values or her words. Mom never cared about wealth accumulation or business expertise. She cared about family, about fairness, about treating her daughters equally. People change their perspectives when facing death, Victoria replied smoothly. Mom became very concerned about preserving her legacy and ensuring her assets would be managed by someone with the right skills and temperament. Skills and temperament, I repeated. You mean someone like you? Someone who understands financial responsibility, yes. I looked back at the will, reading through the language more carefully. The more I studied it, the more obvious it became that this document reflected Victoria's priorities and language rather than Mom's values or typical legal phrasing. I want an independent evaluation of Mom's mental capacity during the period when these changes were made, I said, standing up from the conference table. And I want copies of all previous versions of her will, along with documentation of every meeting and conversation that led to these changes. Frank and Victoria again exchanged that meaningful glance. Elena, I understand you're upset, but your mother's will is legally valid and properly executed. Challenging it would be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately unsuccessful. More importantly, it would go against your mother's clearly expressed wishes. Her clearly expressed wishes, I repeated, my voice heavy with sarcasm. The wishes she expressed while she was so confused she couldn't remember signing legal documents? Victoria's facade of gentle patience finally slipped slightly. Elena, you're being emotional and irrational, she said sharply. Mom made these decisions for good reasons, and attacking her mental capacity is disrespectful to her memory. Emotional, irrational. The same words Victoria had been using to dismiss my concerns for months. But this time, instead of making me doubt myself, it crystallized my determination to uncover the truth about what had really happened during those final, vulnerable months. I gathered my copy of the will and stood to leave. But before walking out, I turned back to face both of them. This isn't over, I said, surprised by the steel in my own voice. If Mom really made these changes voluntarily and competently, then you should have no problem with a thorough review of how and when these decisions were made. As I walked out of Frank's office, I realized that my grief over losing Mom was now competing with fury over what Victoria had stolen from both of us. She hadn't just manipulated our mother's final wishes, she'd betrayed everything our family had stood for. But Victoria had made one crucial mistake. She assumed I would accept this injustice quietly, the way I'd accepted her control and manipulation throughout Mom's illness. She underestimated how far I was willing to go to honor our mother's true legacy and expose the truth about what had really happened during those final, vulnerable months.
That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the copy of Mom's will spread before me, studying every word and phrase with the methodical attention I usually reserved for lesson planning. David made coffee and sat beside me, reading over my shoulder and occasionally asking questions that helped clarify my understanding of the legal language. The timing is the most damning evidence, I told him, circling dates throughout the document. Look, every major change to this will happened during January and February when Mom was most confused and heavily medicated. Before that, according to what I remember from family conversations over the years, Mom always talked about leaving the house to both of us. David nodded thoughtfully. Do you have any written evidence of what she originally intended? Old conversations, emails, anything that might show her previous wishes? I spent the next hour going through years of family correspondence, birthday cards, and holiday letters that Mom had written. What I found was exactly what I'd expected. Multiple references to the house being your girl's inheritance and her hope that we would share the responsibility of maintaining the family home after she was gone. In a birthday card from 2 years earlier, Mom had written, I love knowing that this house will stay in our family through you and Victoria. You girls will figure out together how to preserve all the memories we've made here. The language was unmistakably about shared inheritance, not single ownership based on business expertise. This was evidence that Mom's original intentions were fundamentally different from what the final will specified. But I needed more than sentimental evidence. I needed professional documentation of Mom's original estate plan and expert testimony about her mental capacity during the period when changes were made. That meant finding an attorney who specialized in estate disputes and understood the complexities of challenging a will based on diminished capacity or undue influence. The next morning, I began researching estate litigation attorneys in Phoenix. I wanted someone with specific experience in cases involving elderly clients who'd made significant changes to their wills during illness. After reading reviews and checking credentials, I scheduled consultations with 3 different attorneys for the following week. The first attorney, Margaret Williams, was a specialist in elder law who'd handled dozens of cases involving suspicious will changes. She listened to my story with professional attention, taking notes and asking detailed questions about the timeline of events. The pattern you're describing is unfortunately common, she told me after I'd finished recounting the past year. Family members who position themselves as primary caregivers sometimes use that access to influence vulnerable elderly relatives. The key questions are proving diminished capacity and demonstrating undue influence. She explained that challenging a will required clear evidence that Mom either lacked the mental capacity to understand the changes she was making, or that Victoria used her position as caregiver to manipulate Mom's decisions through pressure, isolation, or deception. Do you have any written evidence of your mother's mental state during the period when the will was changed? Margaret asked. I told her about Mom's inconsistent memory, her confusion about recent events, and her inability to remember signing legal documents. But I also admitted that most of this evidence was based on my personal observations rather than formal medical evaluations. We'll need expert testimony about your mother's cognitive capacity, Margaret explained. Medical records, statements from healthcare providers, and possibly an independent psychiatric evaluation of her mental state based on available documentation. She also emphasized the importance of finding the original version of Mom's will. If we can show that the changes were dramatic departures from her long-standing intentions, that strengthens the case for undue influence. Elderly people typically don't make radical changes to estate plans unless they're being pressured or manipulated. The second attorney I consulted, Robert Chen, took a more aggressive approach to the case. He was particularly interested in Victoria's systematic control over Mom's medical care and social interactions during her final months. Isolation is a classic sign of undue influence, he told me. If your sister prevented your mother from having independent conversations with friends, advisors, or even you, that creates an environment where manipulation becomes much easier. Robert suggested that we could subpoena Frank Rodriguez's files to examine all communications between him and Victoria regarding Mom's estate planning. We could also request medical records that might document Mom's cognitive decline and medication effects during the crucial period.
The goal isn't just to prove that your mother was confused, it's to show that your sister took advantage of that confusion to achieve an outcome that benefited her at your expense. Both attorneys warned me that will contests were expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. Even with strong evidence, there was no guarantee of success. Victoria would undoubtedly fight back aggressively, and the process could take years to resolve.
But they also confirmed that I had legitimate grounds for challenging the will. The timing of the changes, Mom's documented confusion, Victoria's control over access and information, and the dramatic departure from Mom's previous intentions all supported a case for undue influence. The third attorney, Patricia Martinez, offered a different perspective that ultimately shaped my strategy. Instead of immediately filing a will contest, she suggested gathering evidence more systematically to build the strongest possible case before alerting Victoria to my intentions. "Your sister doesn't know yet that you're planning to challenge the will," Patricia pointed out. "That gives you an advantage in terms of collecting evidence and documentation. Once you file a formal challenge, she'll become defensive and less likely to provide information voluntarily." Patricia's approach appealed to me because it reminded me of the careful preparation I brought to teaching complex subjects. Just as I wouldn't walk into a classroom without thorough lesson planning, I shouldn't enter legal proceedings without comprehensive preparation. Over the following weeks, I developed a systematic plan for building my case. First, I would request copies of all of Mom's medical records from her final year, particularly documentation related to her cognitive function and medication effects. Second, I would interview Mom's friends, neighbors, and business associates to gather testimony about her original intentions regarding the house and her mental state during her final months. Third, and most importantly, I would find a way to obtain copies of Mom's previous will versions to document exactly how dramatically her intentions had allegedly changed. Frank Rodriguez had been evasive about providing this information, but there might be other ways to access these documents. I also decided to hire a private investigator who specialized in financial fraud cases. If Victoria had been manipulating Mom's legal documents, there might be other evidence of financial irregularities or suspicious transactions that could strengthen my case. The investigator, a former police detective named Michael Torres, was particularly interested in the timeline of Victoria's involvement in Mom's financial affairs. People who manipulate elderly relatives' wills usually start with smaller financial changes first. They test the waters by gaining access to accounts, changing beneficiaries on insurance policies, or making other modifications that seem reasonable but establish patterns of control. Michael suggested examining all of Mom's financial records from the past 2 years to identify changes that might have preceded the will modifications. If Victoria had been systematically gaining control over Mom's assets, there would likely be a paper trail documenting this progression. As I developed this multi-pronged strategy for challenging Victoria's theft of Mom's estate, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Mom's diagnosis: a sense of purpose and control. Instead of being the passive victim of Victoria's manipulation, I was becoming an active participant in seeking justice for both Mom and myself. But I also knew that once I began implementing this plan, there would be no going back. Victoria would realize that I was serious about fighting her, and our relationship would be permanently destroyed. The sister who'd once protected me would become my adversary in a legal battle that would expose the darkest aspects of our family dynamics. Still, as I looked at the evidence already accumulating on my kitchen table, I knew I had no choice. Mom deserved to have her true wishes honored, and I deserved to inherit what she'd actually intended to leave me. If Victoria wanted a fight, then I was prepared to give her one. But this time, I would be the one with the carefully developed plan.
The breakthrough came 6 weeks after Mom's funeral when Michael Torres called with information that changed everything. He'd been examining Mom's financial records and had discovered something that even I hadn't suspected. Victoria's manipulation had started much earlier and gone much deeper than just the will changes. "Elena, you need to see this," Michael said when I met him at his office. He spread financial documents across his desk like a detective laying out evidence at a crime scene. "Your sister has been systematically transferring your mother's assets for over 18 months, long before her condition deteriorated." The documents showed a pattern of financial changes that began subtly in late 2021, when Mom was still healthy and mentally sharp. Victoria had convinced Mom to add her name to several bank accounts for convenience in case of emergency. She'd also been added as a beneficiary to Mom's life insurance policies and had gained power of attorney over Mom's investment accounts. "Look at this timeline," Michael continued, pointing to a spreadsheet he'd created. "Each change was small and seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they gave Victoria complete control over your mother's finances months before she was actually incapacitated." What made this discovery devastating was that Mom had been fully competent when many of these changes were made. This wasn't just about taking advantage of a confused elderly woman. It was about long-term manipulation of someone who trusted Victoria completely. But the most damning evidence was what Michael had found in the safety deposit box records. Victoria had convinced Mom to add her to the box access in January, during the period when Mom was most confused. The bank records showed that Victoria had visited the box 3 times after Mom's death, removing contents before I even knew the box existed. "What was in the safety deposit box?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "According to the bank's inventory when your mother first rented it, the box contained various family documents, including previous versions of her will. Your sister removed everything and has never provided an inventory of the contents." This was it. The smoking gun I needed. Victoria hadn't just manipulated Mom into changing her will, she had systematically destroyed evidence of what Mom's original intentions had been. The previous will versions that Frank Rodriguez had been reluctant to show me were probably sitting in Victoria's house right now. Armed with this evidence, I scheduled a meeting with Patricia Martinez to discuss our next steps. Patricia reviewed Michael's findings with the focused attention of a prosecutor building a case. "This completely changes our strategy," she told me. "We're not just looking at undue influence during your mother's final months, we're looking at systematic financial manipulation over nearly 2 years, including possible destruction of evidence and theft of estate documents." Patricia explained that we now had grounds for both challenging the will and pursuing criminal charges for elder financial abuse. The pattern of behavior Michael had documented showed clear intent to defraud, not just poor judgment or family disagreement about estate planning. I recommend we approach this in 2 phases. First, we file a formal will contest with all the evidence we've gathered. Second, we report the financial irregularities to the police and request a criminal investigation into elder abuse. The prospect of sending my own sister to prison was sobering, but Patricia reminded me that Victoria's actions weren't just wrong, they were illegal. She'd systematically stolen from our mother and manipulated a vulnerable elderly woman for financial gain. "Your sister is counting on your reluctance to pursue this aggressively," Patricia told me. "She's gambling that family loyalty will prevent you from taking legal action that could result in serious consequences for her." That afternoon, I made the decision that would change everything. I authorized Patricia to file the will contest and contacted the Phoenix Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit to report suspected elder abuse. There would be no more quiet family discussions or attempts to reason with Victoria. This was now a legal matter that would be resolved in court. The will contest was filed on a Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, Victoria was calling me in a fury. "Elena, what the hell do you think you're doing?" she screamed into the phone, her composed facade completely shattered. "You're challenging Mom's will? Have you lost your mind?" "I'm honoring Mom's actual wishes," I replied, my voice calm despite my racing heart. "The wishes she expressed before you isolated her and manipulated her into signing documents she didn't understand." "Mom was completely competent when she made those changes," she shot back. "She wanted me to have the house because she knew I could manage it properly. You're just being greedy and vindictive." "Greedy?" I laughed bitterly. "Victoria, you manipulated our dying mother into giving you a $2 million house while leaving me $50,000?
And you're calling me greedy?
She made that decision based on our different capabilities and life choices, Victoria insisted. Mom knew you didn't have the financial expertise to manage significant assets. There it was again, the same condescending language about my supposed incompetence. But this time, instead of making me doubt myself, it fueled my determination to see this through. We'll let a judge decide whether Mom was competent to make those decisions, I told her, and whether you used your position as her caregiver to manipulate those choices. You have no idea what you're starting, Victoria said, her voice turning cold and threatening. Fighting this will destroy our family and cost you more in legal fees than you'll ever recover. I'm offering you one chance to drop this ridiculous challenge and accept Mom's wishes. Her wishes or your manipulation, I countered, because I've seen the financial records, Victoria. I know about the safety deposit box, the asset transfers, the systematic way you gained control over Mom's finances long before she was incapacitated. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. I don't know what you think you've found, but you're making serious accusations that you can't prove. Mom trusted me with her financial affairs because I was the responsible daughter. Everything I did was with her knowledge and consent. Then you won't mind explaining that to the police, because I've also filed a report for elder financial abuse. They'll be very interested in reviewing all those documents you removed from Mom's safety deposit box. Another long silence, then Victoria's voice returned with barely contained rage. You've made the biggest mistake of your life, Elena. I tried to protect you from these complicated legal and financial matters, but since you want to play hardball, that's exactly what you're going to get. When this is over, you'll have nothing but legal bills and the knowledge that you destroyed our family over your own greed and jealousy. Our family was destroyed the moment you decided to steal Mom's legacy. I'm just making sure the truth comes out. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen, hands shaking from adrenaline and determination. There was no going back now. Victoria knew I was serious about fighting her, and she would use every resource and tactic at her disposal to defend what she'd stolen. But for the first time since Mom's diagnosis, I felt like I was fighting for something that mattered more than just money or property. I was fighting for justice, for Mom's memory, and for the principle that vulnerable, elderly people shouldn't be manipulated by those they trust most. The legal battle would be expensive, exhausting, and probably ugly. But Victoria had made one crucial miscalculation. She assumed I would back down when confronted with serious consequences. Instead, her threats had only strengthened my resolve to see this through to the end.
The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Within 2 weeks of my filing the elder abuse report, Detective Sarah Kim from the Phoenix Police Financial Crimes Unit had gathered enough evidence to arrest Victoria on charges of elder financial abuse, forgery, and theft. The key breakthrough came when they obtained a search warrant for Victoria's home and found Mom's original will, along with 2 other versions, hidden in her home office safe. Patricia Martinez called me at work with the news. "Elena, you're going to want to sit down for this," she said, her voice filled with vindicated excitement. "They found everything. Your mother's original will from 2020 left the house to both daughters equally, along with equal distribution of all other assets. The will Victoria had her sign was the 4th version, and each successive change gave Victoria more control and you less inheritance. But the most damning evidence was what Victoria had done to cover her tracks. She'd forged Mom's signature on several documents and had backdated others to make it appear that Mom had been planning these changes for years. Handwriting experts confirmed that signatures on key financial documents weren't Mom's at all. They were Victoria's careful forgeries. The district attorney is calling it one of the most systematic cases of elder financial abuse they've seen, Patricia continued. Your sister didn't just manipulate your mother, she created an elaborate fraud spanning nearly 2 years. When Victoria was arrested at her office, Derek tried to claim ignorance about the extent of her activities, but bank records showed he'd been actively involved in moving Mom's assets and had even helped Victoria open new accounts that Mom never knew existed. Derek was charged as an accomplice, and their consulting business immediately lost several major clients when news of the arrests became public. The will contest proceeded even more smoothly than Patricia had hoped. Frank Rodriguez, faced with evidence of his client's forgery and his own failure to properly verify Mom's mental capacity, agreed to cooperate with the investigation. He admitted that Victoria had pressured him to rush through the legal changes and had provided him with false information about Mom's mental state. "I should have insisted on an independent psychiatric evaluation," Frank told the court during his deposition. "Victoria convinced me that Mrs. Chen was having good days and bad days, and that we needed to act quickly during a lucid period. I realize now that I failed in my duty to protect my client's interests." 3 months after filing the challenge, the probate court invalidated Victoria's version of the will and restored Mom's original estate plan. The house would be mine and Victoria's equally, along with all other assets. But by that point, Victoria was facing potential prison time and was in no position to dispute the court's decision. The criminal trial began in October, nearly 8 months after Mom's death. I testified about Victoria's systematic isolation of Mom, her manipulation of medical information, and the pattern of control I'd witnessed throughout Mom's final year. Mrs. Rodriguez and other neighbors testified about being prevented from visiting Mom. Patricia, the hospice nurse, admitted under oath that she'd had concerns about Victoria's domineering behavior, but hadn't known how to address it professionally. But the most powerful testimony came from Dr. Morrison, Mom's oncologist. He testified that Mom's level of confusion during her final months was inconsistent with typical cancer patients and suggested that her medication was being managed in ways that maximized her disorientation. Mrs. Chen would sometimes arrive for appointments seeming heavily sedated, even when her pain levels didn't warrant such strong medication. When I asked Victoria about this, she said Mrs. Chen had been having anxiety and needed extra medication to stay calm. In retrospect, I believe Mrs. Chen was being deliberately over-medicated to keep her compliant and confused. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Victoria was convicted on all charges: elder abuse, fraud, forgery, and theft. Derek was convicted as an accomplice, and their consulting business immediately lost several major clients when news of the arrests became public. The judge's comments during sentencing captured exactly what Victoria had done to our family. Miss Chen exploited the trust of a vulnerable elderly woman who depended on her for care and protection. She used her position as caregiver to systematically steal from her own mother while manipulating legal and medical systems to cover her crimes. This represents a profound betrayal of family bonds and societal trust. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when the court ordered Victoria to pay restitution for all the legal fees I'd incurred challenging her theft. The very money she'd tried to steal from me would now be used to reimburse the costs of stopping her.
With Victoria in prison and the estate properly distributed, I found myself inheriting exactly what Mom had always intended: half of the family home and property, along with half of her financial assets. But more importantly, I'd restored Mom's true legacy and ensured that her actual wishes were honored. I decided to keep the house, using my inheritance money to buy out Victoria's half when she's eventually released from prison. The thought of Victoria returning to find that her childhood home now belongs entirely to the sister she'd tried to cheat brought me a deep sense of justice. David and I moved into Mom's house last month. We've restored the garden she loved, rebuilt the library she'd assembled over decades, and turned her office into a space where I can work on the book I'm writing about elder abuse and family manipulation. Every evening, as I sit in the living room where Mom taught us to read, I feel her presence and her approval for the fight I'd waged to honor her memory. The neighborhood has rallied around me in ways that Victoria never experienced. Mrs. Rodriguez brings me vegetables from her garden. Other longtime neighbors share stories about Mom's generosity and business acumen. The community that Victoria had systematically excluded me from has embraced me as the daughter who truly valued and protected Mom's legacy. Victoria writes letters from prison occasionally, still maintaining that she was protecting Mom's assets and that I've destroyed our family over greed. She claims that when she's released, she'll rebuild her life and prove that she was the responsible daughter all along. But the truth is documented in court records, police reports, and the testimony of dozens of witnesses. Victoria wasn't protecting Mom. She was systematically robbing her while manipulating her confusion and vulnerability. The sister I'd once trusted and admired revealed herself to be a calculated predator who viewed our dying mother as an opportunity for personal enrichment. Sometimes people ask if I regret pursuing the case so aggressively, if I wish I'd found a way to resolve things quietly within the family. The answer is always the same. I regret that Victoria's greed and manipulation made legal action necessary, but I'll never regret fighting for Mom's true wishes and holding Victoria accountable for her crimes. Justice isn't always about money or property. Sometimes it's about ensuring that vulnerable people are protected from those who would exploit their trust. Mom deserved better than what Victoria did to her, and I deserved better than being cheated out of my inheritance through fraud and manipulation. Victoria gave me exactly what she thought I wanted, to be the helpless, emotional sister who couldn't handle complex decisions. Instead, I became the daughter who ensured that Mom's real legacy would be preserved and that predators who target vulnerable elderly people would face serious consequences. What would you sacrifice to honor a parent's true wishes? Sometimes fighting for justice means destroying relationships that were already poisoned by betrayal. But the peace that comes from knowing you did the right thing, that's worth more than any inheritance could ever be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.